Good evening, everyone. I'm Lynn.
And I'm Christina. Hello.
And welcome to Night School. We are part of the Nightlife team at Cal Academy in San Francisco. Nightlife is our weekly Thursday night events where we mix science with cocktails, live music, and more. Night School is our at-home virtual version that we've been happy to bring to you over the last year while we're all living in sweats and leggings and things. Last week, we made our return to the Academy with our first in-person Nightlife. So we're currently back IRL every other week. So if you're in the Bay, please come by. Night School will still be with you weekly for those who can't join us. But on to tonight's program. You've probably been hearing a lot of birds over the last few weeks, and that's because it's spring and it's bird breeding season. And that's what we're talking about tonight on Night School, songbirds in spring.
And we have some amazing guests who are going to talk about nests and birds. And so first, from Point Blue Conservation Science, we have Hilary Allen, an avian ecologist. And she's going to talk about some of the sneaky and super fascinating behavior of songbirds and what nest monitoring can teach us about their reproductive success, fitness, and survival. And then we have a couple people that if you've been to night school before, you might recognize them. We have Jack Dumbacher, the Academy's Curator of Ornithology, and he's back to talk about some of the exciting new technologies that researchers are developing to scale up songbird surveys that and move them past manual counting of unique calls and songs. And then finally, our night school MVP, collection manager Mo Flannery is back. And she's in yet another part of the collections tonight. And she's going to take you behind the scenes to explore some of the really beautiful and interesting eggs and nests in the Academy's collection. So, yeah.
As always, tonight's program is live, so say hi, continue to let us know where you're watching from. We always like seeing the geography of our viewers. Let us know if it's your first time joining us or Night School regular. We'll have Q&As after everyone's talk, so get your questions in the chat, and we will now pass the mic to Hilary.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lynn and Christina, and welcome everyone. I'm excited to be here. So my name is Hilary Allen. I am an avian ecologist with Point Blue, and every spring for the last 8 years, I've spent a bulk of my mornings out in the field searching for songbird nests. And tonight I'm super excited to talk to you all about songbird nests and also about what nest searching can teach us about birds and bird populations. So a little bit of background information first. Point Blue is a nonprofit organization, and we work throughout California and beyond. And our mission is to conserve birds, other wildlife, and ecosystems through science partnerships and outreach. Point Blue was founded in 1965 as the Point Reyes Bird Observatory, and in 1966 we moved to the Palomar Field Station, which is at the south end of the Point Reyes National Seashore, and this is where biologists have been studying birds ever since. Today, our headquarters is in Petaluma, California. So our roots as an organization are in bird research. These days, we study many other taxa and systems, but here at the Palomar Field Station, I'm here this evening. Here at the Palomar Field Station, we still have a focus on songbird research. We also have a focus on training scientists here at the field station through an immersive internship program. And I myself actually started out with Point Blue and also with bird research as a nest searching intern at Palo back in 2014. And these days, one of my primary roles is as an intern trainer and supervisor. So I train interns here in bird banding and nest searching techniques. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the data that we collect here at Palomar, but first I'm going to talk a little bit more generally about just nesting ecology of songbirds. And before we dive in, I just want to make a quick note that this is a pretty brief talk this evening, and I'm going to be talking quite generally about songbird nesting habits. And if anyone has any specific questions, even after the program today, you can feel free to email me with any of your questions. Or better yet, you can also come and visit the field station. We're not open at the moment, but you can check here on our website to learn about more information about when we will be opened again to the public. I love talking about nests, so I'm always up for questions about nests and nest searching. All right, so when and why do birds nest? Many of you may already know that birds build nests, and they build nests to lay their eggs and raise their young in. And the goal of all birds during the breeding season is to successfully fledge young from their nests so that they can pass on their genes. And nest success is also, of course, important for populations of birds as a whole, because nest success determines whether a species is able to maintain a stable population over time. So birds, their number one priority during the nesting season is to keep their nests safe. Songbirds are altricial, which means that when they hatch, they're quite helpless and they're naked, and their parents have to care for them for quite a while until they're able to be on their own. Here in North America, most of the songbirds breed in the spring and the summer months when the food is abundant and the weather is mild. So this is the general nesting cycle that most songbirds follow. So it starts with the establishment of a territory and finding a mate. Once that is done, they begin to build a nest and then lay their eggs in the nest and incubate. And once the eggs hatch, they feed the nestlings in the nest for usually a week or two until they're developed enough to leave the nest or fledge. At that point, the parents continue to care for them until they are old enough to be on their own or become independent juveniles. So this is a pretty simple cycle, but the success rate of songbirds is they have a relatively high rate of nest failure. So if at any point during this whole process the nest fails, they start back again from the beginning, and they will continue to try throughout the breeding season until either they are able to have a successful nest or until they no longer have enough time to try again. So the nesting cycle starts with establishing a territory, and birds stay basically within the bounds of their territory for the majority of the breeding season. This was kind of a concept that I didn't really think about until I became an intern here. And so the size of territories is dependent on the species. So larger species tend to have larger territories, but the size can also be dependent on the quality of the habitat. And the timing of territory establishment, it also varies from species to species. So resident species, for instance, so those that are living in the same place year round, they're able to start establishing a territory earlier in the season, and some of them even have a territory year round, whereas migratory species have to arrive on their breeding grounds before they're able to establish a territory and begin the breeding cycle. So territory boundaries are maintained primarily by singing, and typically only the male sings. And boundaries are also more or less species specific, so you can have many different species occupying and breeding within the same space. So during the building of the nest, so most songbirds build open cup nests like this wren tit nest in the photo here. And the location of the nest itself can vary by species and also by individual. So certain species are ground nesters, some of them nest in grasses, some in shrubs, and some in trees. And individuals also sometimes have preferences between those. And a nest is built over the course of either days or weeks, and that kind of depends on when it is in the nesting season. So early on in the nesting season, sometimes birds take a particularly long time to build a nest because they still have plenty of time. And I also just want to say that nests are incredible. I get excited every single time that I see a nest, and I nest search a lot. Okay, so during the laying and incubation period, so songbirds typically lay 3 or 4 eggs, and the incubation period is about 14 days long. And so during this incubation period, typically it's only the female that is participating in incubation. And during that time, she will be sitting on the nest for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, and then will leave for 10 minutes at a time to go and forage before returning back to the nest. Nestlings and fledglings. So once the eggs hatch, both the male and female help to feed the nestlings. And nestlings are primarily fed insects and berries, kind of depending on the species. And there are also some species that are fed seeds. So things like finches eat seeds when they are nestlings. And when nestlings are developed enough, which usually happens between 7 and 20 days, so that's a pretty big range. That's really dependent on species. So some of the smaller species, it's really risky to be sitting in a nest, basically waiting for a predator to come eat you. So they want to get out of the nest as quickly as they possibly can. So with some of the smaller species, they're able to be developed enough to leave the nest at only 7 days old. And so once they leave the nest, the parents continue to care for them for another week or two. And in some cases, there are certain species and certain individual birds that will actually have a successful nest, and then we'll try to have a second nest for the season. And so we refer to those birds as double brooders. So in those cases, sometimes the male will continue to feed the fledglings while the female goes and starts to build a new nest and start that whole cycle all over again. All right, so what can nest searching teach us? So first, I'm going to say that bird banding is another technique that we use to study birds. And with bird banding, we capture individuals and take various morphometric data on them. We determine their age and sex if possible. And then they're fitted with an aluminum band on their leg, which has a unique 9-digit number on it so that we can track that particular individual over time if we capture them again. And this type of information gives us a lot of information about bird populations. Nest searching, on the other hand, it gives us very different information because it's a very intimate view into what is happening in the population during the breeding season. So it's just a different way for us to build a baseline understanding of the relationship between birds and their environment and the types of things that they need to survive. So nest searching can tell us about, it can give us a direct measure of nest success and productivity. And this is since we're tracking individual nesting attempts, and we can follow each nest and see whether it fledges or fails. And it also gives us information on breeding phenology. So we can learn about when migrants are arriving, but then also subsequently, when are they actually starting to build nests and lay eggs. It also gives life history information and habitat requirements. So this type of information is really critical to guide conservation efforts and land management. So a little bit more now about the Palomarin Field Station. Biologists have been studying birds and their habitat here since 1966. And there are 2 internship programs here. So we have the banding internship, where interns learn to run our mist nets and band birds to study population demographics. And then we have our nest searching internship. And nest searchers study the reproductive success, individual fitness, and territory density of songbirds breeding here at Palomarin. And also, when we're not in the midst of a pandemic, the field station is open to the public so that people can come and see science in action and talk to us about birds, and sometimes even see a bird in the hand. So this is a map of the study plots at Palomarin, and this is where both the banding and the nest searching activities occur here at the field station. And then we have a couple of photos here. So this is from the 1970s and then in 2006. And this is showing that there has been rapid habitat succession over the 54 years that we've been studying here. So the study site started out as primarily a coastal scrub area, and the dug-fir forest has begun encroaching into the scrub, and we have a lot of mixed shrub and forest at this point. And so we're able to track that change in the habitat and also see what changes are occurring in the bird community and how they're responding to this change. So the bird banding started here in 1966 when we started at the field station, but the nest searching program didn't officially start until 1980. And the nest searching program encompasses a variety of data collection. So we map, we collect territory maps, so we map where and how many territories there are for all of the species that are breeding here at Palomarin. And this type of mapping gives us a detailed view of how the songbirds are distributed across our study plot. So the nest searching interns also learn how to follow birds and interpret the behavioral cues to help them find nests. And once we find a nest, we monitor it until it's no longer active, so either it fledges or fails. And we look at site-specific information about the nest. So we look at how high it is in a shrub or tree, and we look at what type of substrate it's in. And this gives us information to understand what might be important for these birds to have nesting success. So, for instance, does a particular species do better if they nest in shrubs versus trees? And also for each nest that we find, we also band the nestlings if the nest does make it that long. And we're collecting information on the vegetation in the study area as well. And that is across the entire study area as well as at each nest site specifically. We also have a color banded population here at the field station. So we have focal species that have color bands on them so that we can identify individuals in the field. And that helps us monitor them more closely and also helps us with establishing where the territory boundaries are. And we also color band the nestlings of many of our species here. And that allows us to track family trees over time. And we can also look at how far birds are dispersing, and also things like longevity of our population and mate fidelity. All right, so this is an example of a territory map. And so this one is for wren tits in 2018. And this is across our entire study area. So there are about 50 territories drawn here. Each circle represents the territory of one pair of birds. And we collect this information over the course of 4 or 5 months during the breeding season. And we're keeping track of where individuals are moving and where they are singing. And we have one of these maps for every species of bird that's breeding here, which is about 30 species for every year of our study. And so these maps give us information on the bird community and the bird density here. And here is a figure that shows the relative number of territories of 4 of our focal species for each year from 1980 to 2018. And we can see trends in local populations. So for instance, the Wilson's Warbler, which is in orange here, you can see that they've been increasing at Palomrin over time, whereas the song sparrows and white crowned sparrows, which are the light blue and the green, have been decreasing over time. All right, so what can our data help us answer? So we can look into the timing of nesting. So when birds are initiating breeding and how this may change from year to year, and also over the course of many years. And so we can be looking at whether there are any responses to changes in weathers or habitat conditions. Nesting success is also something very important that we look at. So how many birds are successfully fledged in any given season, and how does this success rate change over time? So the rates of nest success are important for understanding why species populations may be growing or declining over time. We can look at habitat and climate change and the songbird response to that. So how is the plant community changing and how are the birds responding? And then, like I said before, longevity. So we can actually, with our color banded birds out on the plots, we can look at how long birds live and whether their individual nest success rate changes over the course of their life. This is just a couple of the things that we can look at with our data. The nest searching data is really robust, and we can look at a lot of different aspects of songbirds. So nest searching, it's a super important part of songbirds' lives, and it often happens right under our noses. They're super sneaky during the breeding season, and we often just don't realize that it's happening right in front of us. So I hope that you have a little bit more information now about nesting birds and maybe look at birds differently when you see them during the breeding season. And there's so much more for us to learn and understand about songbirds. And nest searching really provides us with some critical information about how bird populations are doing and what they need to thrive. All right, well, thank you all so much for joining again, and also thank you to Cal Academy for hosting this. And here are a couple of links if you're interested in learning more about our program and the research that we do out at the field station. So I think that we have a little bit of time for questions.
Hi, Hilary. We do have time for questions, and we have quite a lot. So let's see how many we can get through. First one, you showed the nesting cycle in the beginning and mentioned that if there is any reasons for sometimes it's unsuccessful and people the birds will have to return to kind of the beginning of the cycle. What are some of the reasons for an unsuccessful nest?
So the biggest reason for an unsuccessful nest is predation. And so that is predation and maybe weather events, but really for the most part, it's predation. So, you have a nest, you have eggs and nestlings in this stationary nest, and they're just trying to keep it safe while other birds in the area are trying to feed their own young. And so there is a lot of predation even within, like, jays predate a lot of nests. So yeah, it's primarily predation.
And then there's a couple questions related to that too. Do nests built in birdhouses or boxes impact fledgling success?
That is a great question. So I mentioned before that most songbirds are open cup nesters, or they build an open cup. So the types of birds that nest in nest boxes, those are cavity nesters. And so in the wild, they would potentially nest in a cavity in a tree, or an old, like a cavity that a woodpecker may have created. So they'll go and nest in those. And so cavity nesters, they may have a higher nest success in some ways. They often have more young, so they're able to fit more young into their nest because it is more protected. but their young also take longer to develop. And so they're on the longer, like towards the 20-day till fledging range. And so sometimes, there's more time for things like snakes to get into a nest box. And so really that is pretty species specific, just that is where they have evolved to nest.
Got it. Going back to kind of the territories, how big are territories for, say, a medium-sized songbird? And do they establish territory by tree, branch, vertical space?
Yeah, that's a super great question. So I guess I don't really know how to measure the space of I guess we do it in meters. So like a pretty small territory would be like a 10-meter radius. And that is, that would be in a location where there's really good habitat and there's plenty of substrate. So with some habitats, especially riparian areas, there is a lot of substrate. And so you have a lot of bushes and you have a lot of trees, and there's just a lot of space for a number of birds to be nesting in and also to be finding food in. So the territory establishment, it really, how they establish a territory, it kind of varies, but it's quite I would say that I was surprised with how large actually a territory is. So, they're upwards of 100 meters diameter, like just a pretty big circle. So, and if you have better habitat, the territory size actually tends to be smaller, just because they can get everything that they need in a smaller space.
Jumping around a bit, but do males and females both sing? And do they sing for different reasons?
Yeah, so with most songbirds, it's only the male that sings. There are some songbirds that both the male and female sing. So here at Palomar, wren tits are one of our study species, and they are one of the few songbirds that both the male and female do sing. And so with species like that, the female wren tit does kind of help. She helps to maintain the territory with her singing. There are also some species, so things like a white crowned sparrow. White crowned sparrows are super interesting because females occasionally sing, and they primarily sing in a situation where a male has two females. And so those two females are semi-territorial with each other, and so they will sing at each other. So it's like they're kind of defending their own territories within the male's larger territory. So there are a lot of different circumstances like that. I know that some female birds sing on the wintering grounds, but not on the breeding grounds. There's a lot of weird stuff with bird songs.
Interesting. Here's one. So you showed the chart of the Palomar field site and just kind of the declines and inclines. What might account for the decreases in sparrows? And then I believe there was another species near the site.
Yeah, so a lot of what we attribute those decreases in the white-crowned sparrow and song sparrow, and then the increase in the Wilson's warbler, we attribute that to the habitat change that has occurred here. So song sparrows and white-crowned sparrows, they prefer coastal scrub. So this used to be a coastal scrub site, and so there were lots of song sparrows and lots of white-crowned sparrows. And as the Doug fir forest has come in, it's kind of pushed them out because it's no longer ideal habitat for those species. And on the flip side, the Wilson's warblers have started to increase in numbers because they are more associated with forests. So we can kind of see this changes in the territories of different species out here, and depending on what kind of habitat they prefer.
Interesting. Last question, Hilary. What kind of behavior should I look for that might be related to nest building in my backyard?
That's a hard question. It's what I spend months training interns how to do. But so during each of those different parts of the cycle, you're kind of looking for different clues to look for nesty behavior. We often talk about birds looking suspicious, but that is something that you kind of have to be pretty familiar with what a non-suspicious bird is before you can tell that they're being suspicious. But the most obvious thing is that they will carry material to the nest to build it. So they'll have a beak full of a bunch of grasses or sticks or something like that. And so you can watch them bring that to their nest. And similarly, when they're feeding nestlings, they will have a bunch of food in their bill as they go to the nest to feed their nestlings. So those are two very, very important things to look for.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Hilary, for joining us tonight. There are a lot more questions if you have time to like take a look.
Awesome.
But thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn.
Thanks. Up next, we have Jack.
Cool. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to survey birds now and in the near future. And we've already heard a little bit about how you survey nests and a little bit about banding. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about another method. But one of the big questions that people have is, how healthy is your land? They have quite a bit of land. You might be, National Forest land or U.S. Forest Service land, national parks. And they're all doing management and they're trying to keep their lands as healthy as possible. And a lot of the management that they do, they want to know, is it helping? And how is it affecting the health of your land? And I would argue that one of the best ways to study the health of your land is by studying the biodiversity on it. And it's both an indicator of the health of the land. So if the land or the ecosystem is supporting the diversity of different species that should be living on it, the native species that should be there, that's telling you that the land is healthy and that's supporting all the species that are there. But biodiversity is even more important than just being an indicator because it's also a driver of ecosystem health. So if all those species are there, then they're doing all the things and providing all the services that those species can provide, from the plants providing all the food, ultimately providing the food for all the other species. But, the birds are also, some of them are prey, some of them are predators, some of them disperse seeds, some of them pollinate plants. And then there's beetles and fungus that decompose. And so all these different things are very important, and it's important that biodiversity be there. And so that's one of the things that we do at the Academy is we study biodiversity. And so when we go out with our colleagues to these places and we want to understand whether the forest or what some other ecosystem is healthy, we look at biodiversity. And because I'm an avian biologist, I study birds, I look at avian biodiversity, although we have colleagues who are looking at other things in these same forests. And so I'm involved with a really nice study up in the Caples Creek Study area, which is in the South Lake Tahoe region. South or just downstream basically from Kirkwood Ski Resort, and it's mid-elevation forest. The watershed is quite large, and it's very interesting because it hasn't been disturbed on any major way. So there's been no fire, there's been no logging for well over 100 years. And so some people would say that that forest is in a decadent state, that it's overgrown. And one of the big fears is that if fire was introduced to the area, it could burn, catastrophically and really do a lot of damage to the forest and make it not very resilient. It, may not bounce back very quickly. And so we're going in there and working with Forest Service colleagues and other colleagues to ask the question, how healthy is that forest? And they had planned a prescribed fire, which actually was done in 2019. And one of the things is we were able to get there before the fire, so we have pre-fire data, and now we're going back to understand, how did the prescribed fire affect forest health? Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Who were the winners? Who were the losers? And so that's why we're out there studying birds and all the other biodiversity that's there. So how do we actually survey the birds? So what we're using is a technique called point counts, and it's a way to cover a lot of ground. It doesn't give you nearly as much, in-depth information as Hilary can get from their study, but we're able to cover a much larger chunk of land. And so the first thing that you have to do is get points gridded over the entire landscape. So this is a map of the Caples Creek watershed here. And then all of these points here that are in different colors are the points that we've selected for study. And so we have to get to each one of these points to do a count and see what birds are on each one of these points. And now these points all have different attributes. Some, they have different slopes, they have different aspects. They have different vegetation types, they have different elevations. And so it was important for us to choose a variety of points which really truly samples the entire habitat that we're interested in here. And then what we basically do to do a point count is we go out to the forest and we stand in one place for about 10 minutes, for exactly 10 minutes, and we count all the birds that are there. This is what one of our data sheets looks like. And you can see this is the station number, the time that we get started was 5:58. And then here's the list of species that we saw. So this is Townsend solitaire, western wood peewee, dark-eyed junco, western tanager, etc. And then this is a tally of how many we saw at each distance. And now because we have a list of which species were there, we can figure out the occupancy, that is just the richness of species that are there. But because we have a set area in that circle that we're counting, and we count how many individuals there are, we also can get estimates of abundance. And so both of those measures are theoretically very important. So we have 80 different points that we've been surveying for 5 years. And each year we survey each point 3 times, and a different person has to count them for each one of the counts. And so we have 3 years pre-fire, we have 1 year post-fire, and we're gonna be out there for the next couple of years continuing. So already to date, we have almost 1 million individual bird detections on our points alone. So we have a lot of data that we're able to play with and begin looking at. And we've detected 62 different bird species in the Caples Creek Study area on our points. We've detected many more species than that out there, but on the points and apparently breeding, we have about 62. So here's a list of all the different species, and you can see that there's a big variety, and there's a big variety in how abundant they are. So some of the things like mountain chickadee, red-breasted nuthatch, and Steller's jay are very common, and we find them on over 80% of our points. So we usually encounter them many times in a morning. And then there are other birds that are very rare, like calliope hummingbirds and Hammond's flycatcher and Wilson's warbler, and those only appear on 1 or 2 points in a year. But one of the things that's interesting is that you have to be a pretty good ear birder to do this work, because about 97% of the detections of birds are heard. So we primarily get them by hearing them and not by seeing them. And only about 3% are seen only. And so, so point counts are very labor intensive. They require highly trained staff. You've really got to know your bird calls. And they're really limited to only about 10 minutes per point count. And so, there are certainly things that we're going to miss when we're out there. The other issue with point counts is that they don't scale particularly well. So, here's a map of the eastern side of California, and here you can see Lake Tahoe. And here's our Caples Creek Study area south of Lake Tahoe. But we also are trying to do some point counts and study some management practices up in Sagehen, which is up in here. And we would like to do more in the Lake Tahoe Basin. But it's very difficult for us to find people capable and to hire them and get them out into the field in that narrow window of time when birds are breeding and singing, so that we can actually get accurate counts of what birds are breeding in these areas. So it doesn't scale very well. And if we want to scale this up, we're going to have to find some different techniques to do there. So is there a better way? And so after the first year of our doing this work, we were contacted by some folks from the Nature Conservancy, and also this person, Mary Clapp, who's a graduate student, a PhD student from UC Davis, and she's been doing some really neat experiments with automated recording units, also known as ARUs. And these recording units are kind of like what a camera trap is to getting visual images of animals. These are basically recording units that sit up there, and they have a left and right microphone. You tie them up to a tree, and they can record any time of day or night. They can sample many, many time windows if you want. So you can get them, every 15 minutes, it records 15 minutes. So then you get a half an hour for every hour. You can do it in the middle of the night, in the day. And so we can sample a lot more time and a lot more areas than we could with point counts alone. And then the recordings can be analyzed later. And if you do that by hand, it still takes a tremendous amount of time, and you still need trained people, but you don't spend all of that time just moving from point to point and traveling between points. One of the downsides to the recording units is that it only captures vocal animals, but we're lucky because most birds, when they're on their breeding territories, are vocalizing. And so it does still capture most of the avian diversity that's out there. And you can also use them to sample some other vocal animals like frogs and many insects. So then if you have these and you're doing these all by hand, the workflow is basically that you gather up all of your recordings over multiple days for each one of the points. And then you can go through the recordings to pull out a sound event or a sound window. And then you have to identify the vocalizations that are in the window. But what's nice is that these are all digital. And so you can scroll through them pretty quickly. Here's what we call, this is a sonogram. And here on the x-axis, this is time. This is time in seconds. And then on the y-axis, this is frequency. So you can see it goes from just 1 hertz up to about 10 kilohertz. Okay, so it's quite a big frequency range. And once you look through a lot of these, you begin to recognize them. For those of you who are birders in the crowd, you probably already recognize that this is a brown creeper. And I have, here's a brown creeper here, and I'm going to play this sonogram for you. So some of you will recognize that's a brown creeper. He basically says, trees, trees, beautiful trees. Okay, and what's nice is that you can look through these recordings, and for the very stereotypic type of calls, you can begin to recognize them by their sonogram as well as by their sound. So sometimes you can go through these recordings much faster. You can do 10 minutes of recording even faster than just listening to 10 minutes, okay? And then, you know, some of the other things that we might see on these recordings. Here's a black-throated gray warbler, and here's what the sonogram looks like for a black-throated gray. And I'll play that one more time because I was talking over it. But it's much more buzzy kind of sound. Here's a hermit warbler. That was still the black-throated gray. Now we got the hermit warbler. So you can see how different they look visually, but they sound really different too. And so a good birder can tell them by sound. But if you're used to looking at these kinds of recordings, then you can also do it by eye. But it still takes a lot of time for each person to go through these and to look at them. And there still are going to be some calls and vocalizations which are hard to classify and hard to bin. So ideally what we want to be able to do is use, because all of this data lives in the digital world, we want to be able to use machine learning algorithms or some sort of computer algorithm that can do this. And so so with Mary working in the field on the recordings, we've teamed up with some sound engineers from Google, some software engineers from Google, and they've been donating their time, and they've been really great colleagues to work with. And they basically have the same workflow. So we gather up the recording, the computer pulls out the sound events, and then the computer identifies what each one of these vocalizations is. And they're able to look through terabytes of sound data from each season relatively rapidly. And so the workflow kind of looks like this for these kinds of data. So we work with, we start with Xenocanto data, which is an online repository for bird songs. Check it out if you've never seen it. It's xenocanto.org, and there's tons and tons of recordings of birds from around the world on it. Then this is fed into a machine learning program that our colleagues at Google write. And then we use that to analyze our recordings. So Google was able to use 2,200 parallel servers, something that we can't do. And it takes our ARU recordings, and basically what it does is it pulls out each individual sound, separates them, and then it does its best to classify each sound as one of our species, and then it gives us a table of results. And so right now we're working with some of the results that we've gotten from the pass from Google from last year's data. And what we're working on right now is trying to evaluate those results and create a focused training data set. So it's working incredibly well from my point of view, and it's learning faster than a lot of birders that I've taken out to the field, but it still gets a lot of things wrong. and it still misses a few things. And so what we're trying to do now is create a focused training data set from our Caples Creek study area so that it can recognize the birds as they sing up in Caples. And we think with that next training data set that we'll be able to put this back into the machine learning program and then run that again iteratively until we have a really good machine learning program. So that's kind of what we're working on right now, and we're really excited that this technology is getting close. And the last thing that I wanted to leave everybody with is that there are a lot of different teams working on this problem, and we are definitely not the only team. And one of the other teams that's doing just fantastic work is the team from Cornell Lab of Ornithology and Chemnitz University in Germany, and they've got some other collaborators, and they've put together a deep neural network, a machine learning program as well. And they have also put together what they call BirdNet, which is a bird sound identification software that works on the web. So it's not yet available to researchers to do the kinds of things that we're trying to do with Google, but we're working together, and the sound engineers that we work with are sharing information from Cornell. But what's cool about BirdNet is that they have a free app for your phone that you can download. In fact, this is a screenshot of my phone with the BirdNet app on it. And it works like this. When it comes up, it begins to capture sound, and you see a sonogram here. And this is little chips that go, and you can kind of see that it's a descending whistle type of note. And then you stop this, and then you get that screen. You can actually take your thumb and grab a section of the chromatogram here, and then you have the option of analyzing it or saving it. And when you hit that analyze button, then it sends it up to BirdNet. It looks at it for a couple seconds, and then it tells you what it thinks it is. And it also tells you how certain it is. And in this case, that sound was a lesser goldfinch, and it said that it was very certain that that was a lesser goldfinch. And this app only came out a little bit over a month ago, and I've been playing with it with the bird classes that I teach, and I've been incredibly impressed with how well it's been doing. So I wanted to leave you with that, because you can actually play with this technology at home in your own backyard and have a lot of fun with it. It costs you nothing, but you do have to own a smartphone, and it's very cool. And I think you'll find it to be a lot of fun. And I also wanted to thank all the people who've been contributing to this work, from U.S. Forest Service, El Dorado National Forest, from the Cal Academy, Mary from UC Davis, the Google engineers, and lots of interns who've come and helped us do point counts and work with us in the field. So thank you very much. And I think there might be time for a couple questions.
Yes, there are. Thank you so much for letting us all know about that app, because I am very excited about it. Anyway, super interesting stuff. But one question at the beginning, you were talking about point counts, and you said that over the past, I don't know, 5 years, that you determined that there were nearly 1 million individual birds. How do you come up with a number like that?
Well, it was actually 1 million detections. So if we just count everything that's on our data sheets, trying to actually figure out how big the population is in that study area is a much more difficult thing to do. And we probably, there are ways to do that with point count data, but it's not as accurate. And most of the analyses that we're doing right now just work with occupancy. So it's basically just looking at the study, the species lists, and looking at things, like, is it there or not? And what's the probability that it's there, even if we didn't detect it? And then and working with those numbers primarily.
Great. Okay. So how, you talk about how point counts, you need like highly trained birders to go out and to do that work. How do you turn someone into a birdsong expert? Or like, what are some of the qualifications that you need to do this sort of work?
Well, usually the people that we work with are already pretty good birders. So we've tapped into the Bay Area birding community, which has a ton of really good birders. In fact, I recognize a few names of folks who are in the group tonight. And oftentimes we'll invite them out to the field, and we'll see if they want to, come and try and pay them what we can. And And then, you know, sometimes we get interns, and the interns usually have some experience. And then to train them, they'll usually come with us to the field, and they shadow each one of the point counters for many days. And even us, because, you know, we really do this kind of work in the spring when birds are singing, but then come midsummer, you know, birds will stop singing. And so we're going to be spending about 4 days or 5 days in the field, just, you know, relearning and becoming refamiliarized with all the calls this year. And then as we do that, this year's interns and point counters will come out in the field with us, and they'll go through a bunch of these, and, you know, and we won't put them out there on their own until they're basically, you know, hearing all the same things that we are hearing, and are getting them right. So, and it takes some time. And, you know, the other thing is that, you know, there's still birds that I hear that I'm like, I get stumped with, or there's vocalizations that are strange, you know, or birds with who knows why, sore throat, or, you know, they're saying something that's unusual, and, you know, we can't put every call in the bin. But the hope is that if you're out there for a full 10 minutes, you know, the birds that are vocalizing, you'll be able to identify over that period of time.
And is that 10 minutes determined by, what is that? How do you determine that 10 minutes is the right period of time?
Well, it's interesting because bird researchers have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what is the right amount of time. And most studies either use 5-minute point counts or 10-minute point counts. And we do a 10-minute point count that starts with a 5-minute point count, but then it extends an extra 5 minutes. And so what's nice about that is that there are other people who've done point counts before us that are only 5 minutes. So we can combine our data with theirs, but our data is a little bit better. And we've been able to show that, you know, we do get a little bit more for that extra 5 minutes. But there's a trade-off in how long you spend at each point and how many points you can do. Because we have to be on our point when the sun rises, which is about 5:45. And sometimes we have to hike many miles to get to the spot. And there's no trails through most of this area. You know, there's no trails to each one of those points. And so we have to get up very early in the morning, and then we start the point counts at 5:45, and we have to be done when the bird stops singing, which is around 9:15. So, you know, you can only do, and the points are 400 meters apart. And so, and again, there's no trails between them. So you're just bushwhacking through the forest and over rocks and up cliffs. And so, you know, we can really only cover about 5 to 7 points in a morning. And so the trade-off is that if you spend more time at a point, then you're doing fewer points. So 10 is kind of that sweet spot.
Okay. When doing a timed point count, is it important to stay completely silent?
Yes, you try and stay as silent as you can. And the other thing that you do is, you know, you arrive and you're winded, you're, you know, from hiking out there. And so the first thing that you do is you kind of quiet down, you get your gear out, you know, you settle down, and you might give it a minute or two for, you know, for birds to get used to you being there, and then you start. And that gives you a chance to catch your breath. I usually will also take a little recorder and set it down next to me. And then that way, if there's a song that I hear or some sound that I hear that I can't identify, I can bring that recording back to the camp, and we'll all sit and listen to it and see if we can figure out what it is.
That's great. Similarly, somebody asked, do you hear regional variations in songs in birds of the same species?
Yes, in fact, one of the birds that the algorithms are having a very hard time identifying are hermit warblers, and the hermit warblers that we have up in Caples sing a slightly different song than they do in other places, and so that's one of the reasons that we need, you know, directed training data from Caples, and that's I think going to really help. The other thing that happens is that when you've got hermit warblers and yellow warblers and Nashville warblers all singing in the same point, their calls kind of converge sometimes, and they mimic each other. And fox sparrows and green-tailed towhees also do that. So sometimes when you're up there, it just drives you crazy, because you're like, I think I heard a hermit warbler, and you're like, no, maybe that was a yellow warbler imitating a hermit warbler. And then, you know, and it's usually that you're hearing them both, but they do kind of converge, and it can just be, yeah, it can be really hard. one thing that's nice about the sonograms is that it's much easier to tell them apart in the sonograms sometimes. So, but yeah, there's a lot of regional variation, and birds will say different things on different mornings. They can, they'll use a slightly different call sometimes.
Yeah. And then finally, like when you have, like 3 birds all at once kind of merging their songs, how is the ARU doing with that? Like, is it able to pick them apart yet, or is that something you're still working on training it?
Well, oftentimes, even if they're all calling at the same time, it all just mashes up in our ears, but they're often singing at different frequencies. And so they tend to get separated sometimes in the recording, or you can separate them by frequency in the recording, even if they're at the same time. The other thing is that the recordings, they'll be recording all morning. And so even if they're singing over the top of each other right now, in a minute, they'll be more separated. And so if you just wait long enough, you'll usually get, good, clean, clear, separated calls.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight and sharing. This is really exciting stuff. So we're looking forward to hearing more about how this all progresses.
Well, cool. Well, I'll try and come back later when I have more data to share. So thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jack. Okay, now we are going to go and we have Mo Flannery live from the Academy. Let's go get her.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Birds and Mammals collection. So in our collection here, we have 100,000 bird specimens, study skins, 32,000 mammal specimens, and 11,000 eggs and nests. So the egg and nest collection is a smaller part of our collection here in Birds and Mammals, but it's also an important part. And you're really lucky tonight because most people do not get to see the egg and nest collection. Even on tours, we don't really show this part of the collection, but here we are. And our collection is part of the Academy's entire collection, which is over 46 million specimens, but that is all the departments: anthropology, ichthyology, herpetology, geology, invertebrate zoology, and I'm probably missing some other ones, but we're a small part, but we have a lot of diversity in our collection. So I'm gonna do a little presentation about the egg and nest collection and some of what it's used for. So next slide. So we have a total of 11,000 catalog specimens. 75% of our egg and nest collection is before the 1920s, and 95% is before the 1950s. And that's primarily because egg collecting was a popular hobby, especially with young boys, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, before birds were protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And boys would go out and kids, I'm sure there were some girls that did it too as well, but they would go out and they would follow the birds, just like Hilary was talking about. You look for birds with either building material, nesting material, or feeding young, and you follow them very carefully, trying to be careful not to lead predators to them, so you keep your distance. And then you identify the nest. A nest just by itself in a tree is not easy to identify. You actually have to see the birds that are building that nest and are using that nest in order to be 100% certain of who the nest belongs to. So all the nests and eggs in our collection were actually identified to species. We have 11,000 sets of eggs, but if you count all the individual eggs, there's over 33,000 individual eggs, because some birds have 3 or 4, some have 2, some have 1, some have 12, depending on the species. And we have over 3,000 nests. We're not a huge egg or nest collection. The Western Foundation of Vertebrate Zoology has, as far as I know, the largest collection with over 225,000 eggs and nests. Next slide. So our nest and egg collection range in size from teeny tiny hummingbird eggs, which I'll show you some, to a huge elephant bird egg that is in our extinct specimen case. And a huge range of sizes in between there. Next slide. We do have some unusual species that are important for the collection. We have some passenger pigeon eggs, and we also have, I think, the only marbled murrelet nest and chick. We have a chick from that nest in a scientific research collection. It was one of the first marbled murrelet nests that was found in a redwood forest many, many years ago. There's actually a paper written about it as well. Next slide. So as I said, most of it was a hobby back in the 18th and 19th century. When people built their egg collections, they also traded eggs. So kind of like trading baseball cards or Pokemon cards or something for today's population. They would contact each other and swap my special eggs for your special eggs or species that they didn't have. There was also a catalog. You could buy eggs from a catalog. So back in 1902, in a catalog that I was looking at that we have in the collection, there were robin's eggs and there were condor eggs that cost $300. So in 1902, $300 is really a lot of money. My lights just went out in the room. So I'm not sure how I'm going to show you the rest of this, but we'll see how it goes. I might have to run off and turn the lights back on. Next slide.
I was going to say, Mo, you can totally go and turn on the lights.
Turn on the next slide, and I'll see if I can talk about it while I'm walking.
Okay.
So let's go to the next one. Okay, so back then, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act started in 1918. Woo, it's really dark back here. And that was to protect birds because bird feathers and eggs and nests were part of the millinery trade. So they were part of women's hats. And we can't really blame people from back at the turn of the century because they didn't have plastics or other things that they could make designs with. But birds did need to be protected. And so the Migratory Bird Treaty Act went into effect. So it's illegal for anyone to have any parts of birds and their eggs, nests, or feathers. And that's because you can't prove that that egg was abandoned or the nest was already finished or that you killed the bird. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act has been really helpful in protecting birds over time. And it's run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Next slide. So birds and our eggs and nests are an important part of research, and that's why they're part of our research collection. They've been used over time to look at environmental contaminants in eggs. You can get DNA samples, parasites. A researcher was in here looking at Galapagos nests to see if there was a nesting parasite that they're seeing in modern day Galapagos birds. They are a record of birds breeding in an area at a certain time and place. And they also give us life history information about where the bird was living. Often they'll be recorded what type of tree and how high it was or bush. And you can look back at the vegetation that was used in nests in certain areas that will tell you more about the plants that were in that area at that time, say in the late 1800s. Next slide. And in our collection, we often have used the eggs and nests for artists too as well. There's a beautiful book by Sharon Beals called 50 Nests and the Birds That Built Them. And she used our collection here as well as several others to make these beautiful photographs of bird nests. So not only are the nests artistic in and of themselves in the wild, but they're also artistic for later use in the collection. And next slide, that might be the last one. Yep. So oology is the study of eggs. So let me show you a little bit of our egg collection just so you see kind of what a case looks like. So we're just down one of our rows. I'm going to bring the egg camera out. So this is just what a typical tray, pretty bright. Let me see if I turn the light down. Oh, that's a little better, huh? A typical tray of eggs. So you can see each one is way too bright. Maybe no light is better than that. 2 or 3 eggs. They're identified as species. They're all nestled in the little boxes. And some of them, like this one here, see if you can read. You can't really read that, is from 1890. So they're really a nice historical perspective. One important study that came from eggs was done early on when peregrine falcons and pelicans and other bird species, we can turn off the egg camera now, were having problems with their nests. So what was happening was peregrines were nesting and their eggs were actually cracking underneath the female when she was sitting on them. And so researchers looked at peregrine eggs and the thickness of the shell, and then they went back to research collections and also measured the thickness of the shell. And they correlated that at a certain point in time, the eggshells started getting more thin. And that fell right along when agriculture was using DDT as a pesticide. And so when DDT was banned, birds were able to recover. Their eggshells started to get thicker again, and they weren't losing as many eggs in their broods. So historical egg collections, if we didn't have those collections from before the use of DDT, we wouldn't be able to compare what the eggshells were like before DDT and then what they were like after DDT. And then now that DDT is banned, we have similar eggs added to the collection. So I'm going to show you some of the nests as well, some of my favorites, and then some of the bird species that you might see out in the wild. So now we will go back to the camera again. So those hummingbird eggs are really quite amazing. They are about the size of a Tic Tac. And so let's look at this one because you can see in the dark one. Teeny tiny, here's my finger for comparison. That's an Allen's hummingbird nest and egg, there's the nest. So small little tiny nest made with lichens and moss. Birds will use all sorts of types of fiber, spider webs to hold it together, little lichens on the outside for decoration. And it's well rested in the little twigs that it was hanging on. And that one is from 1885. This one is an Allen's hummingbird, which also nests. This is from San Rafael in 1887. So another small hummingbird nest that is just really quite stunning. Let me see if I can look at it on the side. That's probably going to make you all sick, maybe from that side. Teeny tiny. And the hummingbirds, the nestlings have to stay in the nest for a very, very long time. Hilary talked about some songbirds when the fledglings hop out and the parents have to feed them. They, they can fly, but not very well. Hummingbirds need to be able to fly right away when they leave the nest. And so they get really big inside that nest. Another species that we can find in the Bay Area that has also done a great job of learning to live in urban environments is a bush tit. So bush tits are a small, very small bird. They pair up in the spring and they build these pendulum nests. So the nest would be hanging here from the top, from a branch, usually in a small tree or bush. And it takes about 40 days for them to build the nest. And in this species, the males and the females will actually build the nest. In a lot of species, the females are the primary nest builders. And then the bush tit nest, you can see it has one little hole here in the top. That's where the parents go in and out while they're incubating the young and are incubating the eggs and then feeding the young. And actually, when a bush tit nest fledges, this one doesn't have a hole, the young will come out the side of the nest often. So they'll make another hole and that's how they fledge. And then they're off on their own. Bush tits can have about 5 or 6 young, I believe. And so the parents are very busy with all those young flying around after they fledge from the nest. Here's a typical nest that some of you may see around your area, an American robin. So you can see it's different from the hummingbird nest, of course, much, much bigger. They often will use mud around their nest. Other birds that use mud are swallows and phoebes. And we actually have a robin that has nested on the Academy building up in the rafters under the roof for many, many years, right above our rear entrance. And then another one of my favorites in an urban environment is a California towhee nest. So towhees are a ground feeding bird. You'll see them hopping around on the ground. They've done really well in urban environments, and they can succeed in nesting. And this particular nest is interesting because it was on a farm, and all of the inside of the nest is horse hair from the tail of a horse that was in the area. So just a really beautifully constructed nest. And then someone had asked about brown-headed cowbirds, and I thought it would be fun to share with you the nesting strategy of brown-headed cowbirds. So cowbirds do not actually build their own nest. They are a brood parasite. And a cowbird is about the size of a blackbird. It's in the same family, and they nest in other birds' nests. So this is 4 eggs. 3 of them are brown-headed cowbird eggs, and 1 of them is a white-crowned sparrow egg. And this was found in Golden Gate Park in 1994. There are quite a few white-crowned sparrow net eggs in the collection, or sets of eggs that also have cowbirds. So the cowbirds have an easier time, I think, in Golden Gate Park parasitizing white-crowned sparrows. But what they do is the female cowbird, who can lay almost 40 eggs or more in a breeding season, will nest search just like scientists do, and probably even better than scientists. And they will find the nests of smaller songbirds, like the white-crowned sparrow or song sparrows or warblers. A lot of warbler species are parasitized by cowbirds, and they will lay their eggs in the nest. Sometimes they kick out the eggs of the host species. In this case, there's 1 host species egg in there, but you can see they're very similar size and shape. So the adult bird doesn't even really know that their nest has been parasitized. And then when the chicks hatch, the cowbird chicks are much more aggressive than the native songbird chick. And so, well, cowbirds are native too, but to the host species chick, why don't we turn off the camera so I don't make people sick? And then you see these host parents, a small warbler being followed by this big cowbird chick saying, feed me, feed me, feed me. And there's no young of the host species. So the cowbird is ingenious in getting another bird species to raise their own young. They just lay the eggs, and then the other species raise their young. So some birds make livings in different ways. And one last nest that I just wanted to show you, a large part of our collection comes from the Galapagos. We have we have the world's largest collection of birds from the Galapagos. And this is a Galapagos finch nest. And you can see that even though they're a cup nester, they have a little roof over their nest. So it's not quite the pendulum, but the adults would go in this hole here. And that helps protect the young and the eggs from the heat, the equatorial sun. And this nest is really beautiful, and so are many of our other Galapagos finch nests, because it has the Galapagos cotton tree, little puffs from the cotton all in it. And this nest is from 1906. So most of our collection from the Galapagos is from 1905 and 1906. So we can learn from birds nesting during the breeding season. We can learn from birds in scientific research collections. And I hope that tonight you learned a few more things about breeding birds in our area. And you can go out and find either nests or birds singing and learn some bird songs and get as much joy out of the birds in your area as those of us who study them full time do. Thank you for coming.
Hi, Mo.
Hi, Lynn.
I feel like that's the second time the lights turned out on you during night school.
Yeah. I should remember because it happens on the hour. So when I'm in here and that was the sea otter one. It was more creepy tonight for some reason.
We'll keep it in mind for next time.
Yeah.
Okay, we have some questions.
Great.
First one is kind of a two-parter. How do you take care or preserve the eggs? And then a follow-up is for the egg collectors, like the little boys who are out. How did they take care of them and preserve them?
Yeah, so they're all preserved pretty much the same historically. We're not very good at it nowadays. It's a preparation skill that kind of has gotten lost over time because we're not collecting as many eggs as they used to. So we have to practice every year. We have to practice on chicken eggs and quail eggs from the grocery store. But it's similar to when you blow an egg for Easter. So when you blow an egg for Easter, you would make holes on both ends of the egg and then just blow into it and the contents of the egg will come out. So with scientific collections, you don't actually make two holes, you only make one hole, and then you push air in and everything comes out. So it's important to find the eggs early on in the incubation period, because once an embryo really starts to form, it's a lot harder to get it out of the eggs. So then the eggs are just dried, and because they have no soft material inside, they don't really attract pests as much as they would if and they don't smell if the soft material was still in there. Is that both parts? Did I answer both parts?
Is that the same process for egg collectors back in like
I'm pretty sure 1920s? They all did it the same way. Yep. Just drilling. They have eggs. We have historical egg drills, like these little tiny hand drills that you drill that make the little perfect circles if you're good at it. So, and nowadays we do get some eggs as salvage. So we don't actively go out and collect eggs because it's so much work to try and find the nest and to collect the eggs. But certain research projects, if they're working with birds and the nest fails, they'll save the eggs for us. But most importantly, we do get eggs from some snowy plover researchers. So that's an endangered species, and it's important to archive their eggs in the collection. So I'm actually going to pick some up from a researcher in a couple of weeks.
This one just came in. Are different eggs stored at certain temperatures?
Everything in our collection is stored at about 65 degrees and 50% relative humidity. So they're all stored in the same case. And they're also sealed cases so that bugs don't get into them, any kind of pests. We don't want any pests in our collection.
What is one of the newest additions to the collection? Because there were so many that was before 1950, was it?
Yeah, before the 1950s and before the 1920s. Well, the newest addition to the collection is actually a mourning dove nest that was in my backyard. They tried to nest twice in the same nest. So some birds will reuse nests through a breeding season. Hilary talked about wren tits. So I actually started as a Point Blue intern 22 years ago as a banding intern and then as a nest searching intern. And one of my favorite birds to search for nests was the wren tit. And wren tits will actually reuse nests throughout the season. And so we don't have a lot of those nests in the collection. But this mourning dove tried to nest twice. The first time we had actually put a camera up so we could videotape and see, because she was very careful. Like, we never saw the birds changing, because the males and females will incubate. We never saw them changing. She just sat on the nest the whole time. And then there were chicks. And for a couple of days, we thought, oh my God, she's not feeding those chicks. What is wrong with this bird? We've never seen her feed the chicks. So we put a camera up a safe distance away, and we were able to see, oh yeah, there was the male was coming, they were feeding, they were doing a good job. And then a cat, an outdoor cat, came and climbed up the trellis and got the chicks. So we left the nest there. They tried to breed in it again. They had eggs for about a week, and then they were depredated by an avian predator, probably a scrub jay. So birds have a hard time, but they keep trying. And now they're nesting in a planter. So they've given up on that one nest. So that nest is coming to the collection now. Hopefully they'll be successful in the planter.
Yeah, hopefully. That nest has quite the story along with it.
Yes.
How long does it take for a bird, say a Galapagos finch, to create a nest?
It depends on the species. Like the bush tit takes about 40 days for them to build the nest. But a typical songbird can build a nest in a few days, maybe up to a week. And then their incubation period is shorter, so like 12 to 14 days typically. And then the nestling period is sometimes 12 to 14 days similarly. So it really depends on the species, but some nests can be built really quickly, and some, like the bush tit pendulum, that takes a lot of effort, takes a much longer period of time to build.
Yeah, I would think so. Here's a question kind of related to the cat story. Many people put their furs out for nesting birds. Is this a good idea? Are there dangers of flea treatments or toxins for the birds?
I haven't thought about flea treatment. If you used a topical flea treatment, I would say probably better not to, because that's a pesticide. Yeah. Although it might help and keep parasites out of the bird's nest. They wouldn't get flies or anything in their nest. But birds will use any kind of material, and you will see like people brushing their dogs in the park, and then birds using that. Mud puddles are good for some species like the robin and for swallows, and you'll see them come down and grab mud. So they'll use pretty much anything. So I would keep the flea treatments out. Brush from another area of your dog.
Maybe I'll start leaving my dog's fur out too.
So, well, a good place to do it. It might be reused, right? Yeah. Reuse, recycle.
Yes. Okay, last question. Is there a particular type of nest or egg that you are keeping your eyes out for to add to the collection that we don't have yet?
Well, wrentits are my favorite, mostly because I got my start at Point Blue, and they are an amazing species. And Hilary mentioned that the males and females both sing in that species. They both incubate, and they both care for the young. So they're just incredible. And they are very site faithful. Year to year on the Palomar and grids, you have wrentit families, and sometimes they'll break off their territory for their young from previous years. And they're just an amazing, amazing bird all around. And they're the only bird in that family found in the North America. The rest of the family are all in Southeast Asia. So they're the only species in that family that we have here. And they're only really from the Cascades in Washington down here to Baja California. So they have a very small range along the coast. So they're a really special bird. If you go out into the coastal scrub anywhere along the Bay Area and just listen for a ping pong ball sound song, and that's your wrentit, and they're just incredible. There are even some in the Berkeley Hills. They're really my favorite.
Well,
probably Hilary's too.
Hopefully we can get that into our collection. Thank you so much, Mo. Always a pleasure. And we'll probably have you back pretty soon.
Thank you. I always like being here. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thanks, Mo. All right, bringing back up Christina. Hi.
Hi. A couple notes for people. One, I just linked to the website of the artist, Sharon Beals, that Mo mentioned, who came and took like gorgeous, incredible photos of some of our nests and eggs are being the Academy's collections. So check that out. And also the bird song app that Jack mentioned is called BirdNet. So if you need that again. And also I saw my mom in the comments advocating for the app, saying it worked really well for her. So trust my mom.
Hi, Mama Fong. Thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. Special thank you to Hilary, Jack, and Mo. Loved having you all on. I think we learned a lot today. Next week, I will be heading back to the Academy. We'll have an in-person nightlife next week, so I'll be streaming from there, but Night School will be on YouTube and Facebook. As always, next week we'll be celebrating the Academy's new exhibit, Sharks, with a look into some shark jaws and maws. So we'll get another peek into another part of our collection with some shark specimens. You'll find out what fossilized shark teeth can tell us about ancient oceans, and also learn more about the mechanics of filter feeding. So tune in next week.
Do you want to tell people why we're doing sharks, just as a little plug?
For our exhibit?
No, for Night School.
Oh.
Did you mention the exhibit?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry. I was reading all your comments. Okay, we're going to wrap this up. Subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you won't miss a Night School ever again. Yeah, thanks again for being with us tonight. Love having you here near and far. And yeah, good night, everyone.